Dear guests, the study of international shouldn't pretend to be a science. It couldn't explain the whole complexity of contemporary events through the prism of universal laws, norms, and structures. If anything, the study of international should be an open-ended endeavor in understanding different viewpoints and perspectives. Eventually, this is the way to build a sustainable world through diplomacy and dialogue. Over the year, the war in Ukraine taught me to be attentive, introspective, and critical to the study of international relations. I do not rush with conclusions and judgments. I try to observe as much as possible and listen to as many takes on the conflict as it is conceivable. It is ironic that hard sciences tend to be way much more amenable to change and progress than dogmas of social sciences, since scientists often have humility to know that they don't quite comprehend the object of their study, be it universal laws of nature or the origin of the universe. Similarly, I think no one can truly understand the scope of changes happening in the world right now. This is the idea that I pitched to Dr. David Bosold in our previous conversation that you are about to hear. This conversation marks a tragic anniversary of the Russian war in Ukraine, and in this conversation we together with David share our thoughts and reflections on this war. So if you like the podcast, please subscribe and share with your friends. And as always, enjoy. So, David, I wanted to ask you, I guess my first question would be, like, does it feel that we live through the most severe crisis in modern world history? Or at least one of the most severe, like this, turning points in history?
Did you already ask that question before?
No, I don't.
Because I think I already responded to it by saying that, of course, the question is what time period you would actually like to look at. If you think, is it the most severe crisis, at least for the West and Europe, since the end of the Cold War? Certainly. But then again, the question is, do other countries also perceive it that way? And there I'm not that sure. Yeah. So if you look at, say, India, Brazil, maybe also China, they certainly see the war in Ukraine as, well, certainly a challenge to, or also, I guess, an international problem where, I mean, a solution needs to be found. And you can see that with regard to the Chinese peace plan, whatever you make of that in terms of, is it that the Chinese really seek peace? Is it just a move to also rhetorically support Russia? I mean, that's all something that I think depends on your own perspective. But as such, I think that our focus in Europe is certainly one where we see this is the most severe threat to political stability that we've seen since the end of the Cold War, yes.
It's also interesting for me that it's been a year, and of course, it's like this podcast is kind of like anniversary, and we discuss like
a sad and tragic anniversary, one has to say.
Yeah, of course, but it's also like we talk about this war, and we talked about this war over the year, and what's interesting that it's still like a big crisis, but the life goes on, like especially in Europe.
I think that's because the two of us are not that much affected in the sense. Of course, we have seen a huge influx of, here in Berlin, Ukrainian refugees. But of course, if you have a family member on either side of the front. If you have otherwise relatives who have either been killed, who had to flee their homes, I think you do have a different perspective on the war. The same could go for instance, my children who have Ukrainian students now in their class. Of course, that brings war way closer to you. If you don't want to, or if you, I put it differently, if you want to continue living your life as it used to before February 24th, 2022, I think you can more or less comfortably do so if you are middle or upper middle class in Russia or Germany. And in that sense, it may feel awkward to some, and also to observe that some people just, move on or just lead their lives as they used to before.
Yeah, that's true. But also, do you think your perspective on the war has changed over the year, or whether, like, if you can a little bit introspect, like, has your perspective changed?
My perspective has only changed insofar as I think much of the debate that we see in the press or in the media or in press statements or in conversations that politicians are having, in speeches that they give, that many things still seem to be unclear, and I sometimes miss a more, say, analytic understanding of the war, because I think I just mentioned the kind of personal relationships that are involved in the war, or the kind of personal contacts that may shape your perception of the war. But then there are others, such as what are the political aims that sort of the Germans should pursue? How do we balance the kind of different interests? So, I mean, the pretty easy thing is, if you just think about this anti-war demonstration that was heavily criticized, it happened last weekend in Berlin. If you think about that, so the overall aim, according to the organizers, is the end of the war. I think that's what more or less everyone would like to see. And then the question is, of course, how can you achieve that goal? The criticism that is often leveled at those people is they are naive, they try to appease Putin, and others say they don't want Putin to get away with simply invading a country, taking something like a fifth or a quarter of the entire Ukrainian territory, and then basically life goes on, or there's a ceasefire, and otherwise you have something like a rump Ukraine or a sort of significantly territorially reduced Ukraine and a larger Russia. Now, as such, I think that perspective is perfectly legitimate. That's not what we would like to have, because as such, there should be the principle that we already find in the UN Charter, and that the territorial sovereignty should be protected of each state, that the more powerful state shouldn't be able to simply invade another country and then simply add that to one's territory. But of course things are then also difficult in the sense of what time horizon are we talking about. I think what we didn't expect last year, or maybe we did, is that the war will most likely drag on for rather a long time, because no side is really backing down. So I was surprised to hear some commentators say that we should expect this year to be the one where the war ends, and I don't see that.
They will say it every year until maybe bigger war. It's actually, I said it in our first episode about the war, that it would be like a prolonged conflict, and definitely conflict that, I'm way much more comfortable in seeing this conflict as like a broader conflict between West versus Russia, or versus like Russia plus China, or whatever, like who wants to join this type of entity or bloc, so to speak. That's why I think it's the conflict that is destined to last for a while. And also I like for me, I had like this idea, of course, and maybe drawing some analogies, because in my free time I love reading on physics, and I love like reading on cosmology, on universe. And when like physicists saying that we're studying like a cosmos is something like that you couldn't really understand. I mean, you could try to like try to calculate it, but like try to have like these formulas, but in the end it's just like you're so small, and like the universe is so big. And I actually want to even draw this analogy to whatever process is happening in the international system. It's the same thing. Again, it's
But
something.
do you mean it's a sort of a natural process that we have difficulties understanding?
It's like,
or is it something that we feel overwhelmed and say, oh, we cannot do something about it?
Both. In a sense, it's something that we just observers, and it's something that we could observe, and it's like it's such a big process, I guess, historically, that really changes the whole like trajectory of humanity. So it's like we can really understand it that much. I mean, we can all bring different perspectives, and we have, of course, different type of ideas. And I think it's important to show and to understand, I guess, as many takes and ideas on this conflict. But as such, it is something like very abstract and something very big and something like I think incomprehensible. Like whenever someone comes and says you, okay, like I know what this is all about, it's probably either wrong or just like the person, like people tend to, again, in the West actually, especially when the people kind of like clogged up into this like bubble of information, and they think they understand the conflict, and they completely kind of shut them from any other perspectives. Like this is like where you have problems, so to speak, because you're not really open-minded. And for me, it's like it's actually like drawing like the like drawing analogy between like almost like cosmology and the study of international, in the sense that it like the process that is happening is that big. I think it's like that incomprehensible.
But you mean it's complex, that makes it difficult to understand, but at the same time that of course leads to the question, who actually has agency, and does agency play a role, in the sense of, I mean, do politicians then can really take decisions that will alter the change or the course of history? Or because I mean, to me it sounds, if I may be mean, like sort of a cheap excuse to say, we cannot really do something about it. And I mean, there are hundreds, thousands of people getting killed. There are hundreds, thousands of homes getting destroyed. And it's just like, you shrug your shoulders and say, well, that's a pity. Yeah. But I mean, as such, there must be some kind of solution. And of course, the cynical take that some take is, unfortunately, it's not terribly unrealistic, is that such wars end when both sides or one side are physically so exhausted that they just cannot continue to fight. I mean, you have a lot of conflict resolution literature that suggests just that, or negotiation literature, and that's often then called the hurting stalemate, if it's more or less that both sides are physically exhausted. But I think that could take still quite a long time. So and I think what you just mentioned about this cosmology thing, maybe we can talk about the kind of different analytic levels, because I mean we started off by basically exchanging our views on how we are personally affected, or we should rather say not that much affected by the Ukraine war. Of course, we have been observing it now for the last year, but if we look for solutions, or if we look 5, 10, 20 years down the road, what do we expect to see in terms of the international system? Because
I mean, I think here I would say again, like using this analogy in the sense that like whatever processes are happening now, they will have like ripple effects in like 50 years, 60 years. So that's why I really think this conflict, again, maybe you don't like this, or I mean you would disagree, but I do think it's something that has like implications for the whole like system. It does have implications for.
You mean the whole globe, the whole world?
I wouldn't say the globe, but it definitely does have implications for the dynamic of the international system. I try to kind of like.
I agree with that point.
Yeah. For the international system, and of course, the end of this conflict like the end of this conflict will kind of determine the whole trajectory of the international system. And of course, here we need to think about China vis-a-vis the US and how this conflict plays out, because I mean, whatever we have now, I think it's something like a prelude to the bigger conflict. And I mean, we kind of see now in terms of rhetoric how rhetoric escalates on both like Chinese and American sides. Again, like people definitely, you could definitely argue that, well, Americans fight a proxy war with Russia in Ukraine, but people also, you could reverse this logic if China gets involved, and I do think it gets involved at a certain point, because it's in Chinese interest to have this war, the same way is it in American interest to have this kind of like prolonged conflict. In a sense,
what do you mean by that? I mean that. You mean that there is that the Chinese side sees it as a way that if they can more easily dictate the relationship, the bilateral relationship with Russia, because as such Russia gets weaker if it is sort of an ally of the Chinese, and otherwise it also exhausts the sort of West in a way. Or what's the kind of take you have on that?
Chinese proximity in the sense of Taiwan. Whatever deliveries they had for Taiwan, they're all delayed because of Ukraine. It's like if China thinks about invading Taiwan, it's in their best interest to keep the fire in Ukraine, because it drags American military infrastructure to Ukraine. I mean, this is already what, people back in the day thought about. Oh, what about like having like, how would American military actually perform on both like fighting two wars at the same time? And of course, I do think at certain point we will see like just basically China-Russia military alliance, and just like declaring to the world that we are now...
Well, you could technically say that has been existing for
but it's
years
not
now, because of course they are both members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and some people said that the SCO is already something like an East Asian or Asian NATO, and of course we'll see what happens there. My personal take is that what we will see is, first of all, what we are not seeing is what some Americans thought might happen, and that is a rapprochement between the EU or Europe, maybe excluding the UK, and Russia. And of course now, after last year and after 2014, that sounds naive anyway. But I mean, if we just go back to the debates after the Cold War, the late 1990s, the early 2000s, we saw this idea that there were so many books about the growing power of Europe, both economically, maybe also militarily. There was the Saint-Malo Declaration back then between the UK and France. We then had Madeleine Albright saying that there were the 3 Ds, right? So no decoupling, no duplication, no discrimination against any NATO member, or, I mean, no European efforts to build up something like a security, not only architecture, but also like a military power that is not part of NATO. And I think a lot of the things we're seeing now are due to sort of a meandering of American positions. I mean, I think we see a pretty much stable pattern in Russia, if we like it or not, and we can all disagree that it's, or we can all say that it's not going in the right direction. It's a kind of way to push for a multipolar world that we wouldn't necessarily need to have. But as such, one has to concede that Putin and Medvedev's takes or positions have not changed that much. Whereas, I mean, if you just look from Clinton to George W. Bush to Obama to Trump, there have been many different changes with regard to what is the purpose of NATO, how do we position ourselves vis-a-vis the European partners. And I think there we are seeing a problem. So now I thought I had too many trains of thought. So you may have to disentangle them again.
Yeah, I think the one thing you said, I mean, it's actually interesting because some people, like some Western analysts, especially based in Europe, they often argue, Germany has to get much more involved and France has to get much more involved in NATO.
That was before 2014.
No, I mean, but even now they say like, well, what I would argue, if you leave like the US out of European security equation, I mean, you actually need to have like, something like, of course, the increase of commitment of Germans and French, but this increase of commitment should come hand in hand with kind of like good relationship with Russians. In other words, like Americans
in the long term, yes, but I mean, also, in the short term, won't happen.
But also, if you think about just pre-war Russia-Ukraine conflict dynamic, if you take Americans out of equations, like of this like particular equation, and you go to Berlin or you go to Paris, they couldn't guarantee what Americans did to Ukrainians, at least like this kind of like ambiguous support. For them, the purpose was to build relationship with Russia, and it means like saying no to NATO in Ukraine or something like this. Well, there was.
I mean, Dimitri, I think you're right with saying no to NATO, but I think the kind of question is why is that? And I think if imagine you're Ukrainian, I think you would certainly be more positive towards the position of the US or Poland these days, because I mean they are at least the two countries that take the idea of security guarantees seriously. So I mean, of course, everything that the French and the Germans did with the Minsk format and all that, technically froze the conflict in a way, but it was also based on the assumption, the implicit assumption that the French and the German military couldn't give any, or the two countries couldn't give any real security guarantees to Ukraine. Because, I mean, simply the military power isn't there. And then the question is, was that because the French and the Germans didn't want to? Maybe yes, also because, of course, building up such a military costs a lot of money. But I think it's also because of the American position that was incoherent over the years. Because, I mean, every time that the Europeans try to, get their act together, try to build up a military structure that would allow them to somehow, contribute to a security architecture, be it European or global, the Americans intervened in a way. And you can see that, I mean, one of the lessons from the Balkan Wars was that after Clinton, most Americans said, hey, Europeans, I mean, we had to come to the rescue of your continent once again. So please, build up, or please ensure that you have the necessary capabilities. That happened. Then the war in Afghanistan was fought. Some also joined the Iraq operation. But I mean, as such, there is no, real European security policy there.
But it's interesting, the observation you made, and I think it's correct, with that you said, well, Americans just want Europeans to behave like Americans. Like, in other words, they want them to fulfill American interests. But they don't necessarily think, well, maybe Europeans.
They would disagree.
No, but like in a sense, let me just finish my this thinking. But like in a sense, Americans never think, but Europeans can have their own security interests, and this security interest can be different from American security interests, because that's what it means to be an actor, to be sort of a power. But also, I want to maybe comment on Ukrainian agency. And I do think, for example, Ukraine has agency, but because of this American involvement in European security architecture, Ukrainians never considered the fact that, maybe you shouldn't be that belligerent to Russia. I mean, in the end, it's kind of stupid to be belligerent to such a country that neighbors you. But But
the question is, what do you mean by belligerent? Because, I mean, of course, I mean, there was no Ukrainian military offensive or no push towards Russian territory.
No, they need to be.
So we are talking about how should we look at the period from 2014 to 2022.
But look at the period before that, and that's what you said during one of our conversations. Before 2014, before the coup happened,
you said it coup. Others call it revolution, right? So I mean,
officially, it's the violent change of government. I mean, so it's
the end of the Yanukovych regime. I mean, most I mean,
whatever,
the literature you will see here, you would call it a coup, others would call it the Maidan revolution. So but you already see that. I mean, if you do have those two contradicting narratives, I mean, it's
but let me finish in the sense that it doesn't really relate to Ukrainian internal question, but like mainly Ukrainian external and foreign affairs question, because well, you have this neighbor that leases your base in Crimea for 100 years. It just signed a contract a couple of years before, during Medvedev era, not Putin era actually. And well, I mean, they're not going anywhere from this military base. You need to understand, if you want to save Crimea, I mean, you have to build good relationship with Russia. I mean, for example, for me, the question of NATO is a little bit schizophrenic. I mean, what you want for Ukraine is definitely have like EU membership. You want economic development, but you don't want to bring this geopolitics into question, because geopolitics, it's a red flag for Russians, because of course they would never see NATO as a benign alliance. I mean, for them it's their enemy. So, and like Ukrainian agency in this type of dynamic could be, well, how could we ensure that Russians not going against us, and how could we ensure that we just build a sustainable, developed country here? And the only way to do it, like, of course, would be to, even now, if you think from like 20 years down the road, their real commitment should be, let's make Ukraine part of Europe, of EU, and let's say no to NATO, because there is no good, because Russia is not going anywhere. That's the problem. But the US, US can say, its commitment again. It goes back and forth. Like like one day it is committed to Ukraine, another day it's not. I mean, like the proximity here matters, because I mean, why did Ukrainian nationalists think that they could just say fuck you to Russians, and Russians would just go and just like give them their military base to NATO? I mean, it's like, this is like a politics here, like, in the sense.
Well, I think now we have so many things to dissect and put on the table.
Sure,
starting from, how do we call the change in government in 2014? How do we perceive of Ukrainian national interest? I'm sure where we both can agree on is that it is difficult for Ukrainians to navigate the current situation, because in order to ensure that they can fight the Russians, they rely on Western support. They cannot fight for themselves, or they don't have the possibility to ensure that they have the arms they need in order to fight the war. That's something that Russia can do. Then the other thing that you mentioned is, somehow they have to come up with a strategy how to behave towards Russia, how to navigate that bilateral relationship. I think there you see more or less anywhere in the former Soviet Union republics, bar the Baltic states, because they have been now independent for such a long time. I think that they're sort of out of the question here. How do you, balance a rapprochement to the West, be it to the European Union or to NATO, and relationships with Russia? And do you offend the Russians, or how do you arrange that? So I think it may sound ironic, stupid, cynical, whatever, but from what you said, I think the only way you imagine that could have worked out without seeing the war as a result would have been to actually change the kind of order. Because if you look at recent history in Europe, it was always that the states first joined NATO and then joined the European Union. And you think it could be the other way around, so that you would have the Ukrainians joining the EU first, and then maybe or not joining NATO. But is what you basically mean is that NATO membership is a red flag for Russia, and irrespective of whether we think that it feels encircled, that it is encircled, whatever. We have read these debates for ages now. As such, would you say that there was some kind of miscalculation on the side of Kyiv? Because that's something I had the impression you were alluding to.
Again, if you just take Americans out of equation, even military support, it's not like the West can support Ukraine apart with Americans. It's mainly they mainly rely right now on American support, because who else going to give them $100 billion? I mean, that's the whole Russian military budget. Again, if you just take Americans out of this equation, then you have completely different dynamic. This again,
of course, but I mean that's
comes
obvious.
the questions to agency, like, in a sense, and then and this dynamic means that Ukrainians also would have to adjust to behaving differently vis-a-vis Europeans, vis-a-vis Russians. But once you bring American perspective, because American perspective is like actually also a little bit cruel, because they use Ukraine as a proxy. I mean, it's not that they are very interested in building a sustainable Ukraine. For them, it's it's like kind of like a chip in the game against Russians.
Well, I mean, I think that's difficult to. I mean, again, you would have to look at what are the discussions that are currently happening between Biden, Blinken, Burns, all those folks who are taking the decisions. Yeah, I think as such, you're completely right that without American support, the entire conflict landscape would look different. Also, of course, Ukraine would be much weaker. I think where the big question is, what is the driving force, what is the motivations for the Americans? And I think you would say it's a geopolitical, reshaping of the order. It's a way to transform the trend towards multipolarity, that it actually benefits the Americans. Also maybe with a sort of cynical twist that, I mean, they could simply stop Ukrainian support any minute. And of course, the risk is there if you look to the debates that the Republican candidates are having. There are not only Trump, but others as well saying, well, I mean, why do we actively support a country that is so far away from American shores? We should refocus our efforts towards China. And that's, of course, a debate that is ongoing. So if you are a policymaker in Ukraine, I think the interest must be for them to ensure that if no longer American weapons start flowing into Ukraine, they will need additional supplies from the European side. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing with the Leopard tanks and with the French.
But this is like a divergence in our perspective, very interesting one in the sense of, because I think if you want to have Europe more involved in this question and you want to have Americans kind of out of this question, you have completely different Europe. I mean, Europe in a sense that could not really do what Americans doing, because I mean, Europe is not that much, we wouldn't be that much powerful militarily. But instead they could approach Russians diplomatically and say, hey, like let's just like forget this NATO question. Like what could we do in terms of negotiations without NATO question? Could we ensure, like, could we sign a peace deal, maybe like bring Chinese into question, like keep like Americans out of this negotiations? Could we?
I think that won't happen. At least without the tacit approval of the American side. There may be some kind of.
But maybe who knows? But this is like where there is an agency to Europeans come in and say. I mean, at least like if you look at this debate about Europeans, like what does sovereignty mean? In the end, sovereignty means that you do something that is in your European interest, and European interest is not like first like European interest should be not to make it European war. And right now, like the odds, like, it's kind of like they're not good for Europeans. In a sense, again, that's what I like this analogy. But if you think about the US is a big, like fat dude living in a mansion. And it's like, it looks into like, whatever feels like, Europe, like Europe is just a block of flats. You need to ensure that all European nations live in kind of like in certain sustainable way that allows them, because there are many, of course, national questions in Europe, and the only way is to build through, of course, like in the long run, I think like European Union does, it's to build it through trade, to build through open borders, like exchange, cultural exchange, all those good stuff that like European Union already did. But of course, you need to bring both like Ukraine and Russia into question. But here, comes this like dude that lives in the mansion, and that things like the dude knows how to organize this block of flats. But I mean, what I mean in a sense, if you bring like kind of like.
But do you mean that? I mean that Europeans are more dependent on Americans than the other way around. Sure, I mean that's I think obvious. But I mean you're still looking for a way that Europeans have or might have a different interest than the Americans. I think they certainly have a different perception, and that's something you could see. But on the other hand, I think I don't see that much what they can change at the moment, because you have those almost self-fulfilling prophecies that are being generated by certain narratives. And the narrative that the Europeans somehow have to deal with and the Americans is the negotiation position for any ceasefire, for any solution to the conflict must be that Ukraine is at least in a better position. And that in the current logic means military advances, or means either, retaking a certain amount of territory, or at least bringing the Russians to the defensive. Now, if we look to the battlefield, it looks different. So it looks rather that we see more Russian advances. And so far, the solution or the reaction is, well, we just send more weapons to Ukraine and we are training more Ukrainian soldiers. But of course, what it in the end means is that, of course, more people are being killed. There are a lot of, local fights over certain cities. And that will most likely continue. I think, as such, the debate that we're having, at least in Germany, is not very profound. Because what we see is we have, on the one hand, those people who say, this violence and this war must stop. There are too many people who are dying. And I think that's a fair point. But then the question is, how could the war end? And it could end by negotiations. But then I also see the point that some people say, well, you cannot expect the Ukrainians. First of all, Europeans and Americans cannot dictate when Ukrainians should negotiate. I think that's a fair point, because in that sense, of course, Ukrainian agencies there. You cannot say, Zelensky.
But there is also
do as we please.
The agency is multifarious in the sense like, but what would Ukrainian do without 100 billion aid package, or another one and another one and another one and another one? Like, what would they do then if there is no aid? Like, of course, Ukrainians have agency,
they would behave differently.
They could be incentivized to behave in a certain manner, because they rely now on the aid, so to speak, on American, European aid. But there are many points to disentangle here, but but
I think the easy one that you just alluded to, if we step back and disregard the military dimension, we also have a strong economic dimension. So what we see in the US is we have incredible packages of arms that are being sent to Ukraine, also other financial aid. We're seeing the same in Europe, and then we're seeing otherwise the economic situation. So America is currently heavily subsidizing sort of the green economy with the Inflation Reduction Act. We see also a lot of disgruntled voices in Europe who say, we don't think that's a fair way to treat us. We have problems with market access, so should we do something similar? But as such, I'd say the economic situation is stable, but at least shaky in the sense that we have high inflation, both in the US and in Europe. Then we have Ukraine that must rely on financial and military supports, because otherwise, it is not able to sustain itself economically as Russia is. If we then look at Russia, apparently many experts have been surprised that Russia has proven to be more resilient. But also, of course, it has seen a huge number of people leaving the country, but as such, we're seeing a decline in economics, in economic figures, but I mean, as such, it is not that dangerous to the overall system, I think. So, I mean, they could divert energy exports. Otherwise, the ruble is comparatively stable. So if you just look at that pattern, we see the picture is not as rosy in Europe and in the States as some people like to pretend. It is actually surprisingly stable in Russia, and it is certainly terrible in Ukraine, because Ukraine wouldn't be able to sustain itself without economic and military support.
Like
but where do we go from here? What does that mean?
But there's a complexity here again. Like, just coming back to the point I made before, like the complexity is actually, if you think about it, is incredible. Like you can take so many different perspectives on the issue. You can think from so many different levels, and of course, I mean, if what you said in terms of where is it going for Ukrainians, I think as of now, as I would just see as just an observer, I think it's going really bad, because I mean, if you think about Russian just point of view, what they're doing, they're destroying Ukraine. I mean, of course, they don't say openly, but they almost imply that the more you support Ukraine, meaning the West, the more we will take as many lands as possible, and we will destroy the country. We will just destroy the country. And I mean, their hope is that the Ukraine will collapse at a certain point. I mean, they see it, and of course, I mean, I don't think the time works for Ukrainian benefit, so to speak, because those are not comparable countries. I mean, Russia is self-sufficient. Russia can also get, as we know, Chinese support. And, if the conflict continues with that type of intensity, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years down the road, at a certain point, Russia expects Ukraine, I think, to collapse. And then if there is no body, there is no crime. Like, that's what they're aiming for now. And I think at this point, Russians are not interested actually in negotiations, because they realize that like the Western perspective on negotiations is actually, it's not interesting for Russians, because their perspective. But it's also, I want to going actually back in our conversation.
I'm sure. Yes, sure.
It's just back in our conversation, and actually just linger on this point that you made, just like to maybe add to this point, that I think the West has an ease with the topic of negotiations, because there is no position on what the West wants, or I would say what the US wants from these negotiations. Because right now, when you hear people from administration, people from just expert community, like, what do they really want from? I mean, they understand that they could not get Russia out of Crimea. They couldn't get Russia out of Donbass. Most likely they couldn't, no matter how many type of new weapons they deliver.
But that's still the political line.
But
that's the demand.
Yeah. But because in their again, in their perfect type of scenario, the Russia is just not there. I mean, the Russia is going somewhere else, and
I mean, that's
it collapses.
I mean, no, they say, I mean, weaken the Russian military, and otherwise ensuring that Ukraine can retake the territory that the Russians took, and that depends on whether it is pre-February 24, 2022, or whether it's actually pre-2014, meaning everything including Crimea. But of course, as such, I think the Western line as such is there must be a retreat by the Russian forces, at least to a considerable degree, in order to ensure that there can be lasting peace negotiations.
Yeah, but I also I think again they should be and the complexity of the question is actually mind-boggling, because there are so many roads to take in this, even just in this conversation, not to say in the world right now, so to speak. But I think for me the point I want to make is that if Europe wants to get agency and get more involved, it has to think about the arrangement that includes Russia and Ukraine. They could not be an arrangement that excludes Russia, because Russia is not going anywhere. Even if Russia loses right now all the lands, just imagine it loses Crimea with Russian population that doesn't want to be Ukrainian. In 10 years, they're going to be new Hitler in Russia. Going to be maybe way much more way much like harsher and way much hardcore line in Russian politics. Again, in the country with nukes, and you just don't want, you just like, just for security reasons, you don't want this scenario. And the way to achieve it is like, the only way to achieve it is like to, you know, as I said, like bring Americans out of this equation and just think about European security architecture without Americans, which, I mean, to me, in a sense, probably should be the end goal of European security architecture. Because, I mean, Americans play their good role, but like for now, like their role is actually destructive, I think, in European security. It's not good. It doesn't do any good to the security. So,
I mean that they're certainly not bringing a new European security architecture into being. I would grant you that, but I think I would like to address 2 points. The first is, I think the only way I see either Europeans and Americans actually being able to increase the chances of Russian negotiations, or of the willingness of Russians to negotiate, that's the way I should put it, is by either making it for Russians more costly to continue the war, or to make them aware of the negative consequences. And maybe the two things are identical. What do I mean by that? Mm-hmm. I think that what becomes pretty evident also for the Russian intelligentsia and the Russian foreign policy elite is that at the moment, Russia is becoming ever more dependent on the relationship with China. And both are also, I mean, because economically speaking, it is opening up to the Chinese. And I think as such, the Chinese are gaining more from that relationship than Russians are gaining. So in that sense, they are becoming almost like not a puppet maybe, but I mean like a junior partner maybe in that relationship. Yeah. So I think what we're seeing is that those different jigsaw pieces will eventually lead to some kind of new multipolar or whatever kind of, at least not bipolar world order. And I think there we are back to the question we started with, like how does the world look like in 5, 10, 20, 30, 50 years? I think something that we didn't discuss is, that's the second point. So I think increasing the awareness that the Russians can be at least incentivized to negotiate, to back down partly, to maybe also have some secret negotiations, would be by also trying to, create a rift between Moscow and Beijing. So, I mean, I think in that sense, we are seeing some of the strategic moves, I think, in Europe and America. I think what it will all depend on is on what used to be in Germany it's called blockfreie Staaten. It's a block. It's a G77, the non-aligned movement countries. I mean, that was of course a group that was less important during Cold War times, but I think can now become more important. So we're talking about countries like South Africa, about Brazil, about India, and what we have been seeing over the last year is, be it with regard to General Assembly votes, be it with regard to politicians hopping on a plane and trying to, sign a memorandum of understanding for, economic cooperation, or trying to convince a person like Lula or a person like Ramaphosa to say something about and position the country vis-a-vis the Ukraine war. That all hasn't really worked out well, or at least not in the Western favor. So, I mean, I would see we at times see tacit support for Russia, like in China, and we also see at least pretty much equidistance from Modi in India and from Lula in Brazil, who say, I mean, that's a European problem. And I think there was an interesting quote by the Indian foreign minister, who I think is revealing. I'm not sure whether I can fully recap it here, but I mean, the logic was, I mean, the West and the Europeans should stop perceiving, or should stop thinking that the world sees a European problem as a global problem, something along those lines. So I I misquoted him, but I mean,
Yeah.
the overall thrust of the argument was that, as such, he and other countries, I mean, India and other countries, see the Ukraine war as technically European problem,
Yeah.
and one where also perspectives are different around the globe.
Yeah.
And I mean, as such, they should have, I mean, the West, European countries, Canada, the US, they should also at least try to take into considerations
Yeah.
that countries like India and Brazil think differently about the world. And I think that's where we're looking to. So I mean, it's now trying, Russia and China basically trying to build up alliances with those states. And the same goes for the West. And so I think the
But
nature
actually-
of the international system will, I mean, depend on whether we see some kind of new non-aligned movement, I think. And it's
Or
maybe
I would
it's the BRICS without the R, right? So it's the
I
BICS
mean,
in a way.
I'm not sure about
Or
this-
BIS.
I'm not sure about this type of alliance, but I think if you see Russia and China making a real strategic alliance, like in other words, they're going to control the heartland, so to say, that I think would change the whole dynamic of the geopolitical historical game. Because now, again, it's not that far off to think about like in 10 years when China invades like, I don't know, like Taiwan and Russia invades politics at the same time, being in an alliance, so to speak. And it sounds a little bit too far away from now on, but if you think about from Chinese perspective, well, China is also not going anywhere. China is increasing its military. It's becoming assertive. It also looks at what Russia achieved already with its limited capabilities, and of course it makes. I'm pretty sure it sends all the signals to Americans. You either back down or you're not, but we don't care, to be honest. Like, we will achieve our goals, as Putin said before the war in Ukraine. Like Russian he had like this quote that Russian demands are non-negotiable, in the sense of like we would achieve those, like no NATO in Ukraine, either peacefully or not peacefully. That's what Chinese also saying, and Americans saying what they said in the same way. But like, for me, like what strikes me the most, like if you look at American position, and you already said this during our conversation, it's not really clear what is the American position. Do they really want to bring Ukraine into NATO?
Well,
they have to.
There is an American position, and that is, preserving the unipolar moment to the
Yeah.
best possible extent, or at least, I mean, ensuring American hegemony, certainly. And the question is, how is that related to any kind of international order?
But
and I
like
think there we talk about is perceptions, because I think the Americans still think, maybe naively, that the so-called international legal order, or the international order that they built after the Second World War, is to the benefit of everyone. Maybe they benefit a little bit more, I mean, the Americans. But I think what they really don't get, or what most policymakers in Washington don't get, is that this is a position that is not shared in Moscow, in Beijing, and most likely also not in Delhi and in Brasilia. And I think that's the core of the problem, I would say. I personally don't buy into a lot of sort of the Western critique, or sort of the critique of the West in those countries, that it is just a hollow thing, and it's cherry picking, and the Americans saying, oh, this is the legal world order, you're supposed to behave in that way, and we can do whatever we like. I think that's partly correct with regard to the early 2000s, with the sort of incredible Bush administration hubris of the Iraq War. I think all American administrations ever since have backtracked on that path, and also have seen that it has terrible consequences. But still, the perception is there by many countries, that there are rules for everyone except for the US, and this kind of perception hasn't gone away.
I'm maybe since like my conversation with Professor Viola, I'm into like mental exercises, and I actually ask myself, like, but if you can imagine like the world where there is no strong Russia or no strong China, like probably, like, let's say China is like 2% of GDP and Russia is like, I 0.5.
Make it 5% each.
And you go back into like zeros or to like early 2010s, and you could imagine like, okay, that's what actually we discussed like in the class geopolitics of NATO. Well, for one, like probably the US definitely would invade Syria. Probably the US would invade actually in Ukraine at a certain point. Why not? Like in a sense, like you could see if there was no thing stopping Americans from invading other countries, they would just keep on doing this in their good faith.
But I think, I mean, I think there is really a flaw to your argument here, Dimitri, and that
But they
and
almost
that is
invaded
if you call
Syria.
it invasion, I'm fine. And if you look at Iraq, but I think the real difference is, and I think we've discussed this before, is that the Americans, I mean, they invade a country, but I mean, and they may want to install a kind of puppet regime or a regime that is loyal to them. I mean, that's the sort of cynical take. You can also take everything at face value that they say they want to build a democracy in the Middle East. But I mean, even if you don't buy into that argument, you at least have to concede, be it Syria, be it Iraq, be it any other country, that they are not intending to make this American territory. I mean, I think that's the difference.
The Yuri, yes, but it's 10,000 kilometers away from their own territory. Why would they need this piece of land? But in terms of if you look at like Iraq and military bases in Iraq, it's like almost like in every big city you have a military American base. Like I mean,
you had.
You still have in Iraq, yes. In Afghanistan, not anymore. But
I mean, in Iraq, you have mine American presence, and I mean, they really know that they didn't have a lot of knowledge about the region and the country, because I mean, apparently some Americans were surprised that they saw that Iran actually was now more influential in Iraq after, say, 2005. And I mean, that came as a surprise to many Americans, where, I mean, most experts of the Middle East would go, oh my gosh, I mean, how stupid can you be? Because, I mean, that was a result that, could be expected.
But it also maybe, what I try to say, maybe they're that much richer than anyone else that they just like do whatever they want. They don't even need this territory, but they could buy the whole Iraq. I mean, just make it clear. I mean,
you have a strong presence, and also military presence in places like Diego Garcia and those small islands where there is a military base. Sure, but I mean, continuing your thought experiment of Russia and China each accounting for not more than 2 or 3 or whatever percent of global GDP, I think you would still see a phenomenon that we've seen over the course of history, and that is imperial overstretch. And I mean, that is something that has been discussed. It was discussed by Paul Kennedy already at the end of the 80s. It was then again discussed by people like Kapchin, who talked about that, who talked about the decline of American power, and in that sense we are seeing a decline of American power, and maybe that is a kind of mental hubris that we see on behalf of the Biden administration, on behalf of some Europeans, that they think that America and Europe are more powerful than they actually are, or that they appear to be more powerful. I think it's something we can only judge in 5 to 10 years' time. And I mean, I think what is crucial is, I think, how the relationship between Europe and China will develop. Because in that sense, that is what changes the overall dynamic. And if you read interviews of German CEOs and business people, what they are currently doing, because they have been criticized for their heavy exposure to the Chinese market, and what they are apparently doing is trying to isolate their respective companies' business in China from that of Europe. So in terms of supply chains, they're trying to make those things separate and sort of trying to isolate everything in China. So producing in China with Chinese people, but not shipping things back and forth, so that they don't have repercussions on their European or American markets and businesses. And I think, it will be interesting to see. I mean, if there was to be an invasion of Taiwan and then a similar reaction, namely sanctions. I mean, of course, the effects would be incredible and incredibly stronger or more powerful than the ones we see now. Of course, the exposure of the German economy to Russia was higher than with other European countries, and especially the dependency on oil and gas, of course. But if you look at the German economy and the Chinese market, that's just a different kind of magnitude.
Interesting to me again, because you have Russia, you have just here, China, you have there. How come you have way much more? It's actually what you know.
It's the market. I mean, you have more than 1.23
but you can also
billion
have
people. You have 100 and how many?
But you can also have factories. I mean, in the end, it's also there is some political decision. Well, let's outsource factories to China because, of course, it's also business. But what I'm trying to say that, like, analyzing how the West behaves vis-a-vis Russia, I definitely have this feeling that it didn't really want to build Russia. It didn't want to see Russia as a strong economic competitor. In other words, it didn't.
Oh, I would disagree. I mean, I'm neither a China nor Russia expert, but I mean, from the things I learned back in the days from things that the Ostausschuss der deutschen Wirtschaft, that's sort of the lobby institution of German industry, did the ideas that we had with Petersburger Dialog, right? This bilateral dialogue also of civil society between Putin that was also continuing under Merkel and was started under the Schröder government. We had the so-called Modernisierungspartnerschaft, the modernization partnership. I think now Americans often criticize the Germans that this was stupid, naive, or at least more beneficial to the Russians than the Germans. That's something we can debate, but as such that there was at least the willingness by German industry or by German companies to actually invest in the Russian market. I think that was there. But I mean, what I often heard from those people is that they said there are two problems. One is that the Russians really don't want to invest in a diversified economy. They rely too much on the kind of export of hydrocarbons. And otherwise, they also said that the market as such is way smaller than the one in China, and also they are getting better market access to China. Whether that's correct, I don't know, because I'm not an economic leader or not a CEO of a company, but that's at least what I heard in the conversations back then.
Yeah, I mean, we can maybe spend some last minutes of our conversation trying to understand the future of international order. And to me, as I said, I mean, like, I think the processes that are happening, they're really, like, they're very colossal. And I think we actually tend to, I mean, people, especially in the West, and I mean, I also maybe, put myself into this same basket. We tend to disregard this, like, we tend to really, and from how people talk about this in like very certain terms, and like, people know like what's the main argument, who is right or who is wrong, and what they miss is really is like the things that are happening. I think they're incredibly complex and incredibly big. So if I were to think about, like, international system 10, 20 years down the road, I mean, I don't want to be pessimistic, but of course it will depend on how confrontation between Russians, Americans, and Americans and Chinese, this kind of triangle, will eventually end. In other words, so this is, I think, is the main confrontational dynamic, because neither Russia nor China, would step back. I mean, they make it clear. Those are, like, you can say brightest of their red lines. Like, Taiwan is like Chinese territory. Ukraine is not a part of NATO. It's non-negotiable things for them. I mean, they made it clear that they would make the utmost effort to achieve their objectives. And of course, I mean, the whole international system hinges on this like confrontation. It's in other words, but like to make things,
You
I
mean
mean,
hinges on in meaning shaping it?
yeah, I mean, how it plays out, because of course there are a lot of open questions. I mean, again, you can go in so many different directions because things are not very that great in the United States as well. If you think about the cycle of elections in the US, there is I mean, it's for countries like China, of course, that are complete autocracies, complete dictatorships, and stuff like this. For them, it makes sense just to wait. It just makes sense to wait through one election cycle to another election cycle, because there are some internal problems in the U.S., as we of course all know in John F. Kennedy Institute, polarization, some problems with democracy, and also like just I guess. Especially when you read about the US, it's just the atmosphere in the United States itself is a little bit, off. Yeah, something bad is like it doesn't feel like it's good anymore as it used to be. So I mean, of course, so this is like I think how the situation plays out. But I think actually the role of Europe, and when you said about people who openly, I mean, and I think the role of Europeans should be rethought. So the role of Europeans shouldn't be we should fulfill American needs or fulfill American interests for the Americans themselves. I mean, they could do them themselves if they
I'm not
need
sure
to.
whether that's what what Europeans think. I mean, that's sort of a critique that is often leveled.
But unfortunately, I mean, again, and also I think it has to do, if you think about material perspective, there is like the city is Brussels, and there is no surprise that the same people who work in NATO work in European Union. I mean, this is the same type of transatlantic logic.
What do you mean work in the same city?
I mean, it ends up like the same bunch of people. Like, I mean, quite.
There I would strongly disagree.
I mean, I will, because I mean, there is maybe you have to
But I mean, those are people that are like come from very different backgrounds, and I mean,
I would call them like transatlantic elites, like people who are like, I mean.
But you will find the harshest. I mean, critics of NATO in Brussels, for instance, in the European Commission. I mean,
I haven't heard those voices. Maybe, at least, I don't follow. I follow European politics from time to time, but to me, it seems now it's like they play in unison. Like there is no big difference between Brussels and.
Well, I mean, they are better aligned than ever, the two policies. I'm sure. Yes.
But as you suggested, of course, like questions as American Green Act and something like this, and European Union just simply it can't do anything, because it realizes that it's like this minor again.
Well, it does the same. It does the same thing. But I think that the point I wanted to make with regard to the economy is that I think most of the coverage now on the Ukraine war is primarily a military one, and I think a number of aspects get lost. And one thing is generally the economic situation, the possibility to continue the war for X number of years, and also the effects the war will have on the respective economies. And unsurprisingly, I repeat myself, is of course that the Ukrainian situation in that sense or position is the weakest. But when it comes to the European countries, of course, they have different challenges ahead of them. For instance, one is migration that we haven't talked about in the podcast, but I think that will also be a political issue. And I'm not talking about Ukrainian refugees. I'm generally talking about migration flows. We also are seeing an incredible destabilization of the Sahel zone at the moment, and also an increasing Russian presence there of the Wagner Group, while we see a retreat of especially the French. The Germans are considering to leave. So I think coming back to that idea of imperial overstretch, and that in a hypothetical world where America was still the dominant power and all others were really weak economically, I still think that there is a certain way of influence you can have to, that maybe trade arrangements are more in your favor, meaning in American or favorable to Americans. But as such, I mean, the footprint, if you will, is or would be just too big. So, and that of course means that you have only a limited number of resources, and then the question is, how do you spend them? And I think there we do have people who think strategically. We do have people who think strategically in a global context, and I would think that those people are in London. They are in Brussels, they are in Paris, but they're certainly not that much or not that plentiful in Berlin, meaning German policymakers, because I think they are...
But maybe it's not bad. And the podcast is called Localizing the Globe, in a sense, like, there is a certain like when people talk about the global and something, it means universal, and something that they know that what global means, what they really mean. It means global for people in Paris, in certain offices, and in Washington. But maybe that's a bad way of thinking in general. Maybe there is no such thing as a global. Like there is some regional arrangements, and there's some regional patterns of interaction, so to speak.
Of course, there are regional patterns, but I mean, the thing. What I phrased it wrongly. What I mean is, Germans after the Second World War have always, had a global perspective, but only an economic perspective. If you look around the globe, you will see German products that you can more or less buy everywhere, and I mean German cars, for instance. So I mean, in that sense, German policy has been very successful. There have been always voices who said also Germany must be involved more militarily, or at least be able to operate out of area, or outside of Europe, or maybe outside of German territory altogether. And that's a discussion we have been having since 1994, when there was the ruling by the German Constitutional Court. I'm not suggesting that this is something that the Germans must do, but I mean, at least they should know that action or inaction has certain consequences. And sometimes I think they are still stuck in that mindset of, hey, anything military is something we can delegate to NATO or to the Americans, which sometimes can be the same. And the rest, we just continue being the sort of economic behemoth and trying to be this economic superpower. I think it's something that no longer works. And it's, I think we are seeing, I think this is basically what the Zeitenwende, as it was called, is all about. I hate the term, by the way, but I mean, and I think we're seeing something similar in Japan. So we're seeing more investment into the military. Is that creating more security dilemmas?
Yeah,
I guess so, but I think that's something we would have to discuss in another podcast.
Yeah, but also maybe let me, if you allow me to finish by saying, I guess the Germany misses this dynamic that if the world becomes multipolar, it doesn't mean that you have to come on in and fulfill American lost hegemony, so to speak. You have to come up with your own type of thinking, with your own type of interest that can be very different from Americans. And I mean, I think
they can be, but then the question is, how do you pursue that? And I think if you have more or less different blocks, so I mean, I think if we're talking about the next 20, 30, 50 years of world order, I think there are some historic analogies that some people, pull out of the head. The question is whether they are very good, because I think the problem of historic analogies is always that they, destroy creativity or destroy creative thinking about alternatives. So I think I would be very much in favor of some kind of creative ways to think about different kinds of world orders. But I think what we're seeing at the moment is that something? Will we see something like a new Cold War, meaning a bifurcated world, which is basically the West against Russia, China, and whoever joins either side, and then a group of non-aligned countries. So that's the new Cold War 2.0 thing. I don't find it very convincing, because it would basically mean an economic decoupling, because back then it was that really the connections between the two blocks, meaning the Warsaw Pact and NATO or the West, wasn't very, very high, right? So there was not a lot of physical, economic, whatever mobility. The second alternative is often now referenced with regard to 1814-15 and, the Concert of Europe kind of idea. But of course, that again is a problem because it suggests again that the kind of European solution should be a global solution. And I think so in that sense, it's incredibly Eurocentric or colonialist in a way in terms of thinking, because it would suggest this kind of you're with us or against us, or let us tell you how the world order should look like. And it would also be, of course, this zones of influence thing, something that I thought we had already overcome.
I mean, on the one hand, I think it's good because even if you think about global solutions from European perspective, those solutions are not brought to you by regime change and the most incredible military that the Americans have. In other words, it should be solutions that populate minds, and there should be solutions that that argue and that convince you and something like this. So it's like it has to do something again, and I maybe want to develop in a sense like we are on campus now. And maybe the way to, try to come up with those ideas is like by opening the discussion. Because I do think in Europe, the discussion in international relations is very dire. I mean, you either have American academia and American perspective. Okay, good, let it be there. I mean, it's there for a reason. It has like tradition and history, or like British-American tradition. But there might be something, there is a need for other perspective. I mean, there is a need for European perspective. And of course, in terms of international relations, Europe has a good experience in building, this type of institution, this type of community, which, in a sense, it can replicate, and then it needs to find, and for Europe, it is a pressing need to find an arrangement with Russia. Because again, Russia is not going anywhere. It will be there. It will be there in 10 years. It can even lose the war and come back even more aggressive, and you have to deal with this. So in other words, you have to keep this in mind for Europeans while moving forward, and to keep this in mind, consciously understanding that the security architecture that is built now is American one. And in the end, it may benefit Americans, but it may not benefit Europeans. This is like my
maybe not to the same extent, but I mean, I agree with you that we have some basic flaws, be it in American IR or European IR. And
which is like tries to copy American.
Yeah, but certainly what is while we have apparently an incredible amount or variety of theoretical approaches, we don't seem to take into consideration perceptions from countries beyond the United States and Europe. And I think a lot of the political confrontations, a lot of the political rivalries in sort of real life are simply because there is not a lot of understanding on both sides. But still, I would grant that, for instance, Iranians or Chinese, or most likely as well Russian scholars, at least know pretty well what kind of the Western, European, and or American, which sometimes can be identical, situation or perspective is. And I mean, trying to understand what are the kind of perceptions, traditions, or also self-perceptions of the respective countries, of their role, of the global order. I think that's crucial.
Yeah.
So I mean, that's still an important task that has to be fulfilled.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, and especially again, just having humility, because what's different between international relations, it's the relations part. In other words, just having humility in understanding that the world is extraordinarily complex. It's not a political science. In other words, like the whole term political science implies that it's like calculable. I mean, science is predictable and calculable, but it's not science. That's exactly the thing. There is no certainly right or wrong solutions or answers to this whole complex questions. Like that's why there is importance to be open and critical. And this is, I mean, if you even go back to history, there is a split between like continental and analytical European philosophy, or European like Western philosophy, you can say. So in other words, maybe there is a need for international relations to go like separate direction. Maybe it will lead to certain political changes in the future. So like, thank you very much, and I hope to develop with you, certainly through the conversations, those ideas in the future.
Thank you, Dimitri.
See you next time.